So I called him. He's like, yeah, we need you to talk to Elon. And I was like, oh my God, some of the decisions we had to make about comp or not, horrible decisions. There was asymmetrical warfare because he was so out of control. Good chair will help you make yourself heard. But the main thing is just to keep listening and really, really, really try and learn the business. We were in Denver, we were in Paris trying to sell the shares, and you have to make sure that your business is robust enough to do it.
Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom. I'm Erika Eliasson-Norris. Today I'm joined by Dame Martha Lane Fox. Martha co-founded lastminute.com through the dot-com boom and crash, helped set the blueprint for the government digital service gov.uk, founded .everyone to advance responsible technology, and has served as a non-executive director on boards including M&S, Twitter, and Chanel. This conversation explores how boards create real value, focusing on innovation, decision-making, and culture. Welcome to Grit in the Boardroom, Martha.
Thank you so much. It's actually not just me. We have an interloper on your podcast today. You have to excuse me, there's two of us.
No problem at all. Let's get into it. So if you could secretly sit on any FTSE 100 board today, which one would you choose and why?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think this company would want me, but I think I'd be very interested to be in the pharmaceutical business right now. So, you know, whether it was, well, it's obviously got to be our homegrown one, Glaxo. That's the most relevant one for Britain, I suppose. I think that this is just such a miraculous time of drug discovery, and the combination of AI application to science with then what must be happening internally as well at the same time. I think that will be super fascinating. Also, huge global business, massive consequence with how you distribute your product, all of the stuff that you can imagine. So yes, I think Glaxo would be the one. Although I'd be very sad not to have worked with Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that your knowledge, obviously you've focused in a lot of digital businesses, do you think that knowledge from those type of businesses translates well, or perhaps it's just beneficial to have a different perspective in something like pharmaceutical or other industries?
You know what, I think that after now so long, it's 35 years that I've been doing this stuff, I feel as though it's not just about understanding the digital world. I think for me, it's about having been through moments of really accelerated change and what that means for businesses. So, of course, at the minute, we're talking about AI and the profound platform shift that's happening in companies. And, you know, hopefully I'm useful in my experiences of understanding a little bit about that world. But I think having grown up with change as, I hate this expression, but change is the only constant in my backdrop of my working life. I feel as though, you know, I've been on startup boards, I've been on my own company boards, I've taken public companies' public boards, I've been in private boards, I've been in public private boards like Channel 4, I've been on big FTSE boards, I've been in, you know, crazy boards like Twitter, and and now I'm on the board of British Airways, and now I'm with British Chanel, very different structures again. So literally nothing phases me, I think. And I feel like I've seen a lot of complex situations in those boardrooms, either because of personalities or because of macro environment. And hopefully, I think if you've been lucky enough to have that experience, it's those things that are always translatable. And of course, trying to stay relevant with the world as it's changing is another dimension to that. But I think more fundamentally for the board members, I think just being able to be a bit of a generalist and being able to see the big picture, not feel kind of stuck in a situation where it feel like it's a crisis all the time, but see that wider view. I think that's actually the biggest skill.
I think that's really interesting, because I do tend to find people or companies, when they're looking for non-exec directors, they tend to go towards similar industries to who they already have. So if they're a product industry, they tend to try and find product people. If they're a service industry, they tend to try and find service people. But maybe it's worth mixing that up a bit from what you're saying.
I mean, I think it's both. I think you have to be super clear. If you're finding a particular domain expertise, you have to be super clear that that person can also be outside of their domain, because no board member should just be thinking all the time about everything through the lens of, I don't know, cybersecurity. Very important sometimes to have that on the board and to have that perspective and to have that, especially now, those alarm bells constantly ringing. But it's not helpful if everything is then always channeled through that lens, because boards are beyond that. You've got to be able to sit on an audit committee or a comp committee. You've got to be able to also think about changing CEO and succession plans and the executive team. So I think domain expertise is invaluable, but it can't be the only thing. And I think every board is different, but it's the combination of skills that are what make a robust board.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you've been a founder, a chair, and also a digital trailblazer with lastminute.com. What do you think is one thing that boards consistently get wrong with regards to innovation? Because that's something that you've definitely driven through your career.
Oh, I think it's incredibly hard. I think that innovation isn't something that sits like over here. It's a bit like lots of planks of, I think, how you build a business now. In my opinion, you can't have sustainability sitting over there. You can't actually, we've just talked about cybersecurity, you can't have it sitting over there. Okay, it's done because we have a person worrying about innovation. I think that truly innovative cultures are lived and breathed through every single bit of it. And that, like everything, has to come partly from the top. You've got to have a CEO, you've got to have a board that are actively showing that innovation is something they value and incentivize around. You've then got to have, ways and mechanisms that people in teams can feel they can innovate, either to fail or not, obviously, ideally not, but without the massive consequence of failure, because that's what innovation obviously often produces. So I think probably the biggest error, if it's classifiable as that, is that it's seen as a separate discipline, as opposed to something that, okay, if you want an innovative culture, it's got to be a cultural thing right through the organization. And you have to make sure that your incentives are aligned to that as a real point of, differentiation.
And what sort of companies would you point to as being kind of good examples, maybe not in every scenario, but good examples in certain scenarios that you would, look at?
I mean, I think most businesses do innovate or they don't survive. I think we can be quite hard on corporates, like, oh, they do a bad job. My airline seat is still rubbish, or my supermarket stuff. But actually, I think if we think about it more deeply, as a consumer, the process of innovation over the last 20 years has been unbelievable. It's been unbelievable. We expect things now just right there on our smartphone devices. We expect to be able to do everything in parallel. We expect to go into a store and have this perfect experience. We expect high quality produce at good prices, and we can compare the market in a way we never used to before. So I think, there's a lot of different strands to it, but I think actually, particularly in consumer businesses, we have seen massive levels of innovation. Retail obviously does always innovate, because otherwise, they're not capturing the market in the way that they can. But obviously, the tech sector has been a big kind of disruptor into the macro business climate over the last 40, 50 years. And the culture in technology to test things, to be constantly improving and iterating just because you can, because it's cheaper and the barriers to entry are different, has, I think, created a different cultural kind of culture, alongside perhaps a more traditional corporate culture. So it's not that I'm sitting here saying every corporate is getting it right, but I do think that sometimes it's easy to forget how much experience has changed over the last 20, 30 years. And perhaps, one of the issues that we have right now as a society is that we are operating in a, 1850 operating model in government and public services. And we're operating in sometimes a 2050 model of our, other user, citizen, consumer experiences. And that is such a deep mismatch.
And why do you think that is?
Because I think it's much harder for the public sector. I think public sector, I've done a lot of work in the public sector. I helped create the government digital service, and we launched gov.uk, which was a big step forward for the government of the day, and huge, enormous kudos to the team that enabled that to happen. And when I think about that experience, all the stars were aligned. We had a prime minister who was absolutely determined to do some bold digital things. We had civil servants that we got round to our to help us in our way of thinking, an amazing team that came from the commercial sector to come and do some public service. It was a big push, though, and it needed that. And I think that quite often the public sector's motivations, incentive structures are just not aligned in the same way. You're not rewarded for innovation. You're not rewarded actually for thinking much about delivery in the past. But technology has changed that. So that's why I think right now we are at this sort of delta where sometimes some of the things and the speed and the process that we expect in the normal other part of our lives, government just hasn't caught up with yet.
Mm. And you took lastminute.com through the dot-com boom and the crash.
Yes, the boom part I remember only a little bit. The crash part I remember really quite a lot.
What did that period of time, or those 2 periods of time, what did they teach you about decision making under extreme uncertainty? Because I'm sure that there are people listening and watching this that are boards of directors, they are on boards, they are CEOs, and you've managed some very, very big changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be really lying if I said I could remember with extreme clarity that period of time. I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons, some personal, some professional. After lastminute.com, I had a huge personal accident, and some of the things before it are quite blurry, just as a caveat. But,
of course,
when you're 25, and then I was 29 when we took the business public, Brent and I, you are only ever learning on the fly because you know nothing. So we were in this very strange market, because landscape, perhaps a better word, because not only were we inventing things, because no one had really done a website where people were buying this stuff. Amazon existed in the US. There was a couple of people emerging here, but really not very many. So we were inventing stuff, but also we knew nothing because we were very young and the whole market was developing. So all these layers where really it was not a kind of right or wrong situation. We were just testing and trying to move on quickly and trying to do the right thing and stay very true to the product focus. So I think if I think back to how we tried to help keep focused, it was, many things, but the things that stick in my mind are such a clarity of purpose about what we were building. It was a product both Brent and I wanted to use. It came out of Brent's necessity to always organize things at the last minute. In his late 20s, he was always trying to get everything ready for the weekend and was never anywhere to help organize it. So by having that very clear vision, that helps. And then the second thing is just really making sure we built the best possible team we could around us, both, amazingly bright, young, incredible people, but also people that perhaps had done things in the sectors we were trying to grow the business in.
And how do you think you build that great team? What makes a great team?
I mean, again, back to clarity of purpose, and that being really understood, a really deep shared understanding of the direction of travel, particularly in a startup. You can't say it looks like that because you are building it. So you have to really have a very clear way of expressing the story that you're telling to people that might come and work with you. And I was with a venture capitalist actually just yesterday, a brilliant British venture capitalist, Anne Glover, who said that as a VC, she doesn't really ever just invest in leaders in quotation marks. She invests in people that people will follow, because leading is one thing, but getting people to follow you is another, right? You can also say, right, we're charging in that direction. If no one comes with you, that's not very helpful. So I guess that what Brent and I always try to do is make it feel as though this was an exciting journey, that the people working with us were going to learn a ton. It was going to be a ride. We were going to do an amazing service for our customers and keep reinforcing that all the time. So that's the first thing in team. I think the second thing in team is, in my opinion, didn't always do this right at all, but this is where I think people work well. So beyond that kind of overarching vision, just a very clear set of things that you are expected to deliver. And then, frankly, to be left the F alone. You don't need to be micromanaged if you have got that very clear set of things around you, that clear accountability, and you know what your reward system is going to be. And I think if those two pieces are very clear, then you can have confidence, because it's very clear when things haven't worked and maybe the person isn't in the right role, or maybe they're in the wrong company, or whatever the thing is. But it's so easy to say that and so incredibly hard to do, because in my experience, and I don't know if it's the same with you, Erika, you can think you've told somebody, this is what I think you should be doing and these are the things I want you to own. And they might have had a completely different take on that, or they might not even have heard it.
Yes.
And you have to keep communicating it. It's got to be something that is just such a fundamental point of return all the time, which is really boring as a leader, because it's really boring to keep telling people, okay, just to be clear, you are doing these 3 things, and then to check back in on those 3 things and keep doing it. So you cannot have any room for kind of miscommunication in that. But then beyond that, if you get that bit right, you really can leave good people alone, and then they thrive, in my opinion.
Yeah. And looking at the other side, I was chatting to somebody yesterday about good teams. And one of the things that they said, I asked them what one of the most challenging things was as a CEO. And I suppose it would be interesting to ask you that question. They said that it was the people. And they said that the hardest bit was the human part of it, which was sometimes the making people redundant, firing people, whatever it might be. Did you find the same?
Yes. It's always horrible. And, people are the inconsistent thing, the variable thing, the magic thing, and many times the way you have the fun or the joy often, but also the thing that's the hardest, because we're people, right? We're not just tick boxes, and we're not just ones and noughts. So thank God, but it is also a massive, massive headache very often. And what I've perceived is that it's a rare founder, and I'm really not sure I was one of those people that is able to be the visionary, get the product, drive the teams, and build the culture. I think that is a lot, right? You can often have a brilliant CEO who's got a very, very clear vision of something and might hire some fantastic people to help do some of those other things around them, and has at least the self-awareness not to try and do all the people part as well. I don't think I had that self-awareness at 25. In fact, I think now when I think back on it, at the time I thought, I'm quite good at this culture people stuff. Now I look back on it, I was 100% just fueling the company with tequila and parties and being ridiculous. And as you said, the worst parts always, of course, especially when you're building something at speed and everyone's very young, are when you have to get rid of people or move people on or give people bad appraisals or do all the stuff that is just the bread and butter of business. And, I can say with, a couple of bad days at lastminute.com, but one of the worst was when I had to tell the customer service team that we were outsourcing them to India. And there were probably 100 people, and they were really, really special people. They'd worked with us since the beginning and been on their bicycles dropping tickets around London when things had gone wrong. Wow. And, just been in the trenches with us. And it was horrible. It was really horrible, because even though it made the good business sense and probably actually helped enable them to go off and get better jobs, it was brutal.
Yeah. It's always about the people, particularly if you're somebody that cares. Yeah. Which isn't all leaders, I must say, but no, I think some of the best are.
Good ones do, and I think increasingly you can't get away with not caring, actually. I think that it's now your EQ and your IQ are so much more important than perhaps they've ever been before, because it's a much harder and a more ambiguous world in many ways. So therefore, you need to be able to express that as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to start this podcast in the first place, is to bring to light how hard it can be for leaders to go through some of these processes. And as you say about outsourcing to India, that's something that an employee may just go, well, they didn't care about me. Why did this have to happen to me? They're just sat in their ivory tower and they're just making that decision, and they don't even care about me and my livelihood and my future.
And the equivalent now is, people aren't outsourcing to India so much anymore, but people are replacing bits of teams with AI tools, right? So this is a very prescient discussion. Yeah. And I was just with a business earlier today where just talking about the finance function in that business, and they're not firing people, but they're not hiring any more people. And over the next 2 years, will it shift and change that team? Of course it will. And it's not because the boss of that particular team doesn't care. Of course she does, but she's being judged on a set of metrics. There's efficiencies in the team. There's just people's work constantly changing and evolving. So it is really tough. It is really tough.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you link the kind of outsourcing with similar sorts of ideas to AI. And I've heard that more than once, even just today, on the kind of some of the similarities of, some people, when computers were first introduced, I've read minutes and spoken to people that have written minutes back in the day that said, this is going to change the world. Maybe we don't need too many computers in the office because it's going to be a real problem. And it's really interesting reading that now, because you think, wow, how interesting. And no doubt in decades to come, we will also look back and go, oh, I don't know why they were worried about that, or they should have been even more worried about it. Who knows? What's your take on it?
I don't know. I think that I'm not prone to too much pessimism generally in the world. I proceed with optimism, because otherwise, frankly, what's the point? And but I do feel a kind of generalized anxiety that governments all over the world, here as well, are not taking seriously the very, very, very real shifts in the workforce. And I don't know what that means work looks like. I don't think anybody that says they do is talking nonsense, because who the hell knows what the next 5 years is going to look like, let alone 15. But there will be massive shifts, and the work will look different, and it will look very different for a whole bunch of people, and not the same people for whom often the world has changed most in the past. Everyone's talked a lot about how in the past it was the most kind of entry-level jobs that got affected, and now maybe it's going to be kind of mid-ranking jobs that are going to be driven much more through technology, whether you're a lawyer or whether you're an accountant or whatever your background might be. Sorry. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think we need to keep thinking about it and having public conversation about that, and staying realistic that the headwinds of technology and the climate crisis and changing demographics, that they're very strong. They're very, very strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it must have been interesting to be so young, IPOing a company. What's any advice that you would give to, obviously there's a lot of tech kind of startup founders, whether they're male, female, and just kind of looking at how that landscape looks, any kind of ideas that you might give?
I mean, I think at the right point in time, with the right support and a solid business base, going public is an extraordinary experience. I don't know if we had that at lastminute.com. We were very small. We were pushed to go public to have this insane kind of reputation. And I don't know whether it was the right decision or if we would take it now. It was the right decision in that we got 100 million in the bank. And as Brent says, that was the best defense to business growth or not. Yeah. But it was also brutal, because it was a week before the dot-com boom bust and our share price collapsed. And that's a tough thing to navigate as a young pair of founders with a young team who all thought they might be gazillionaires and were just not going to be. So it was a mixed bag for us, although ultimately it would be bonkers for me to suggest it did anything other than give us the cash pile that enabled our survival. In terms of so I should start with that, because I think there's a tension always in a startup that's got funding from a venture capital or seed funding in some way to have this exit. People need a moment for the realization of their profit, right? And that can sometimes be a real tension, because you can have a business that might not be right to do it yet, might not be big enough, might not be the right business, but there's that internal tension. So then you might need to think about other exits, whether through acquisition or other mechanisms. But the actual process of going public is an extraordinary experience to go through as a CEO, co-founder, founder, because it's really something that's hard to describe unless you've been through it. It's a job for 6 months or so. You have to go and sell very, very consistently all the time to different funds that might believe in your business. We went all over the world to do that. We flew around to Mariah Carey's jet. Very fancy.
Wow.
but you go into this kind of zone where you sort of, in a weird way, leave the business behind a bit. So you have to be sure that you've got somebody that is still making sure business is working and running. And we were in Denver, we were in Paris, we were in, obviously in London, we were all over the place trying to sell the shares. And so that's the main thing, is just to think about focus, how you're going to do it, how you're going to cope with it, what the storytelling and all that's going to be. And at the same time, you have to make sure that your business is robust enough to do it, but also has been set up ready for it. Because when you go public, boom, that's it. Have you got an audit committee? Have you got a remuneration committee? Have you got the right number of board directors? Have you got some VCs off the board and some new independent directors in? So there's all these things that you have to kind of think about in the run up to it, quite apart from the actual quite grueling process of all the sales to get to the point of the IPO.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. All the kind of pre-setup is almost expected at the point that you're looking for that investment. And if you haven't done it already, even though you don't really need it if you don't get the investment, it's that pre-work. It's really important. Yeah. Do you, so when you exited lastminute.com through the IPO, is there anything that you would kind of look back now and wish somebody had told you that would have made that process less painful?
I mean, I think it's hard not to be very personal at this point, because it was such an exceptional time, and it's quite hard to, this was nearly 25 years ago, right? So not quite, nearly actually. That's a long, long time, especially in the tech landscape. Things are very different now. I think that I wish we'd been a bit less naive about what funds do, which is their job, but it can feel pretty brutal when you're in it, which is say, yeah, we're going to buy a bunch of your stock. We'd love to be long-term holders. I can think of 2 funds that did that. They looked us in the eye and they said, we'll be really long-term holders. And then on the day of the IPO, they flipped our stock, which meant they got the bump, obviously, of that uplift in the share price that went from, I can't remember, £3.75 to £5.25, let's say, and then helped in the collapse of that share price. Yeah. So I think if I'd been more on it and Brent had been more on it and we'd understood more, we might have had a bit more clout to be able to build our cap table in a bit more of an effective, long-lasting way. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. I then also think that as was then a young founder, going public is a public moment, it's going public. And although it would be different for founders now, I hope, because it would be less unusual, I personally had a massive amount of attention on me, a huge amount of PR. And I think about this a lot because if it was the age of social media, I think it could have been just completely overwhelming. It was pretty bad then. I got upwards of 100 letters calling me a bitch, excuse me for my language, because the share price had collapsed, right? But imagine if that was the age of social media, what I might have had online. And you could argue I put my head above the parapet. We used, me as an idea to build the brand of the company. And I was a young woman and all that stuff. It was terribly unfair. It was Brent's idea, the company, and he'd get cut out of photos in the press as though it was just this young woman doing her thing. So you could argue I'd done that to build the business, but I think it was much tougher than I'd expected when the stock price began to fall. And I personally got a lot of shit thrown at me. So I think being prepared as a founder that you are now public and your role is very different. You are in a quarterly reporting cycle. You do have to behave in a different way as a company. You can't tell everybody everything internally anymore. It's different. It is just different and not always worse. It's a growth moment, but be aware.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that inflection moment of that kind of, there's the media tend to like somebody to dislike, and they tend to like you for a bit and then dislike you. And that switch is interesting. It's the same with potential celebrities and the like, but essentially somebody that builds a business doesn't do it necessarily to become a celebrity and to put themselves in that situation. So that must have been really, really hard. And I know from the CEO that I spoke, the CEO I spoke to only a couple of days ago said to me that even some family and friends were a little like, oh, look what I've read here. And is this actually right? And, all this sort of rubbish that gets stirred up and started creating ripples beyond just the business side of it. So then it was family life.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't remember that so much, but the age of, what am I trying to say? The age then of kind of the excitement around the dot-com boom and then the bust was pretty intense. But right now it is just as bad for CEOs, right? A little bit of something on social media or a bit of a knock on LinkedIn or something that's bubbling in the employee base. There's a lot of different dimensions to manage as you become more public. And it doesn't happen slowly. It happens boom, just like that. You go a private company on a Thursday and you be a public company on a Friday. And your life has changed and you're in the public eye and everyone knows kind of nominally what you're worth as well. That's another strange feeling because even though I owned 2% of the company by the time we went public, it was still whatever it was, 10 million quid. And there it was very visibly and publicly. And that's a whole other strange feeling too. So there's a lot of different dimensions, none of which is to complain about all of that. That is what you do. You put yourself out there. But I just think as a young founder, I wish I'd been a bit less perhaps naive about some of the consequences of all of that. And I think now it's just as intense. So it's worth being aware of that as well as founders now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've obviously, you now hold non-exec director positions. So you've moved away from that kind of entrepreneur, founder, CEO space into the non-exec director space. As a kind of non-exec director.
You have, however, forgotten my karaoke business, Erika. I did start a karaoke business. Lucky voice.
Yes, I have overlooked that one.
Yeah, there you go. We've got 6 venues around the country. I don't run it anymore, but I did found it. So I haven't completely moved away from crazy ideas. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. That's great. Yes, as a non-exec director, what do you think is one of the most useful questions that can be asked of your CEO? Now you're on the other side of it.
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the moment in time.
Of course.
So, it's very different if you're talking to a first-time beginner startup founder to if you're talking a scale-up founder to if you're talking to a CEO of like either big-scale business or about to be public or public company. So, it is very different. And I think that's part of it. It's, to me, really listening to the CEO. I think that one of the mistakes that sometimes board members make is that they think they're there to somehow catch out the executives or the team, that somehow they've done their job really well. If somebody's got a bit embarrassed in the board meeting, that's just such crap. It really is. It's like, that's not your job. Your job is to pick the CEO, get behind them, and then if you don't like them, get rid of the CEO. Don't keep calling out people. That's not helpful. And with the executives, I have the same feeling, right? When they're in the room, challenge them, of course, ask questions, form an opinion, and then give that opinion to the CEO, their boss. You're not their boss. So I just caveat that at the beginning, because I think sometimes people always think, well, I did a good job in my board meeting because I got Roger on the back foot. It's like, no, you don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, I think questions that people don't ask CEOs enough are things that perhaps feel a little bit more adjacent. Of course, you want to understand how they're thinking about the next 3 years, but how are you feeling about the team? What's worrying you about the people in the team at the minute? Or, what's keeping you awake at night? What's your top priority in the next quarter, and how can we help you get there? Is there anything we can do to make, chances of success more likely? And I think, trying to get into their head, it's really freaking lonely being a CEO. And sometimes the board or the chair or people, some of their peer group, sometimes possibly are the only people you can kind of share that space with. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't have tough conversations. Doesn't mean you shouldn't tell them when you think things might not be going in the right direction. But I would always start from a point of view of like trying to understand what they're thinking about and what their anxieties are, and start from there.
Yeah, I think that's great. Within the time scale of a board meeting, and also given the fact that it's supposed to be more strategic than operational, there's only so much information that a non-exec director or chair can pull out of the executive. And so therefore it is, as you say, a matter of working out where their pain points are. And as you say, encouraging and supporting, assuming that obviously things are traveling in the right direction. And I think you're absolutely right. I have seen way too many board meetings where people have almost points scored, whether it's the CEO with some of their own executive team that might be nipping at their heels and going, well, I'm going to put them down because last board meeting they said, oh, are they your successor? And they just don't, the CEO doesn't want to hear that. And then the next time they just make them look really silly by allowing them to be underprepared. It does not work very well. And the best non-exec directors and chairs after meetings have even come to me and just said, wow, that was brutal and completely unnecessary. And if it does anything, it just says, what is the culture of this business actually like? If someone, the CEO, is wanting to throw under the bus one of their direct reports, who then manages a whole division, not helpful, really not helpful.
Completely agree.
It's very challenging. But looking at it the other side, when you were a chief executive, it's a very different view. And I'm finding this myself on my own board, where I was independent before, and now I am the CEO and accountable to the board. I can now see some of the challenges of coming or going into meetings or coming out of meetings and either kind of thinking, I should have known the answer to that question the board asked me, or why on earth did they probe so deeply on that when there's so many other issues that should have been raised? And I really wanted to get to that, but they just would not get off this one topic. With your view now of being a non-exec director, how do you think that having been a CEO and now sitting on the other side of the table, it's changed your perspective on how you operate as a non-exec director?
I don't think it changed it because I was only ever a non-exec, having come out of being a founder and had my own board, right? So I guess I always have tilted towards thinking about things from the management perspective. And I think most good non-executive directors do try and do that, because most of them have been in some kind of operational role, so don't be too down on everybody. But I think you can, as you get a bit grander and a bit more away from operational detail, it's a bit too easy sometimes to forget what that actually feels like. So I don't know if it changed anything. I hope that's why I've been in any way an effective board member, because I'm kind of starting always with the person. I think the other thing to remember, and I always say this, is boards are basically completely unimportant until they're phenomenally important. And so I always just try and get in my head that the CEO is not worrying about the board all the time. That's not what they feel is going to unlock the success of their company. And if they are, then there's probably an issue, right? So, the CEO is worrying about the customer base. They're worrying about whether the team is right, all the stuff, geopolitical things might be going on. And so just bearing that in mind, I think, is also extremely helpful. And most of the time boards are there to be symbolic. They're doing governance. They're obviously doing the bits of legal stuff they have to do, all that piece. Only at moments of change, crisis, acquisition, all those things, the things become different. And I think it is quite important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. You've worked with some really high profile and continue to work with some really high profile boards. When you walk into a boardroom, what do you think instantly speaks to you about the effectiveness of that board, or what signals toxicity, and maybe somewhere that you might not want to be sticking around for longer term?
I think the relationship between the chair and the CEO is fundamental. If I haven't been the chair, then that's the thing that I think creates the board dynamic. Because if there's tension between them, and I don't mean that there may be a challenging question being asked from the chair, I'm talking about something more fundamental, then it's, in my opinion, incredibly hard for the board to function well, because you just keep kind of ramming up against that relationship. And I've unfortunately experienced that way too many times in my life. So that's the first thing, is just really to understand what that chair-CEO relationship is like, if there's anything you can do to make sure it's as productive and helpful as possible. The second thing, and you've already pointed it out, is how the CEO treats the executive team, the team coming into the board, whether more people do come to the board. Some CEOs can be very private. I don't think that's very good. I think you should be using the board to expose your team as much as possible. That's a kind of indicator. So I guess for me, it is about those relationships initially, and also reaction to questions. So, when you ask a question, are they interested? Do they want to give you the answer, or are they kind of trying to push you away from the answer and close you off?
Yeah. And what do you think is kind of some good behaviours or behaviours that you've seen of the most effective chairs? Because being a chair is a massive responsibility, but also comes with some very different challenges to being a non-exec director.
Yeah. I think most recently, I guess, was chairing WeTransfer up to its acquisition by Bending Spoon's big European tech company. And I guess I saw my role there as, obviously, you just have to spend a lot more time with the company. It sounds obvious, but that's the first thing, right? A good chair doesn't just rock up and chair. You have to build the relationships with the CEO, build relationships with the wider team, spend time in the office, try to, be a bit more of the glue so that people get to know you. They see you. You're not ever acting in a surprising way. They know some of your surprising behaviors. That's the first thing. There's just more time. I think the second thing is, you are chairing the meetings. You're not running them. They're not your meetings. They're not your voice. They're not you deciding. That's the CEO of the company. You have to facilitate the effective challenge, the effective provocations, all the right strategic direction. So a lot of that is about the agenda, making sure the agenda is good, going through it with the CEO, making sure that you're getting to a good cadence through the year, covering off topics that the board members want to talk about. So spending time with the company, setting a really good agenda, and then spending time with the other non-execs. I remember when I joined the board of Twitter, I thought, I come here from the UK, so I don't know anyone here in the US. I'm going to have a cup of coffee with everybody on the board. And a couple of board members said it was the first time that any board member had ever done something outside the board with them. And wow. I remember thinking, wow, that feels completely bizarre, because how can you function as a group if you don't sort of know each other a bit? So I also see a role of chair as kind of being that facilitator, encouraging the non-execs to form not friendships, but professional relationships, be able to work together well. It doesn't just have to be social. It can be, just professional as well, obviously. So if I'm chairing something, I spend a lot of time in the company with the CEO without trying to dominate, a lot of time on the agenda, a lot of time getting to know the other non-execs and trying to facilitate that. So always making sure we have a non-exec only session, a non-exec with the CEO of the company session, and then a wash up after all of that kind of stuff, and make sure if there's anything outstanding, you go back to board members, you call them, you're available if anyone wants to talk to you about stuff that might be worrying them in the business. So, it is work, but it's not rocket science. It's about making the relationships work, in my opinion.
Yeah. And you mentioned Twitter there. So you were part of the board up until the sale of Twitter to Elon. How did that all kind of, not necessarily come about, but how did that work with regards to the board? Because that must have been quite an interesting situation to be in.
Yes, interesting is one way of describing it.
Trying to be diplomatic here.
Yeah, I was chair of the nomination committee when Elon decided he wanted to be on the board. I'll never forget it. I got a text message. So it must have been early San Francisco time. So like after lunch, UK time on a Sunday, from one of the other board members saying, we need to talk. Elon wants to join our board. And I didn't know Elon. I thought it was a joke, basically. So I called him. And he's like, yeah, we need you to talk to Elon. And I was like, oh, my God, because the first line of defense is the nomination governance committee chair. Anyway, as it was, the CEO and the chair met him first, and then I met him afterwards. But, in my official roles as chair of nomination governance committee, I had to manage a process that then turned into acquisition. I was also chair of the compensation committee, so there was a whole bunch of stuff around that with the acquisition of people's comp and what that was going to look like. And it was really intense. And then I was also on the transaction committee. There were just three of us, me and the chair and Patrick Bichette. So it was, for a period of time, it was like becoming an executive in the company, to be honest. It was work every day. I mean, obviously I wasn't running Twitter. I was here in the UK, but we had meetings every day, sometimes multiple meetings. I can remember twice we worked through the night, 24 hours solid without stopping, because we were trying to get contracts done. My 2 holidays completely trashed, and I don't mean like poor me, that's the job. But I think sometimes people don't appreciate that is the job. You have to show up at those moments of crisis. We had one board member who I think just didn't quite realize that, taking your kids to school is not a reason not to come to a Twitter board meeting that was called an hour before. You have to show up. Yeah. So I feel in some ways unbelievably lucky, because it was an exposure to a set of circumstances that most people don't have in their whole career. And I feel as though stuff happened in that 18 months on that board, particularly around the Elon bit, that was on the board, for 6 years, but in that bit that was, most people would just love to have exposure in their careers. But in other ways, it was tough. It was really tough, and it was unpleasant. And, we had to sell to Elon because he'd given us this insane offer for the business, but no one woke up in the morning wanting to trash Twitter. We were on that board. It was a difficult board to be on. It was a complicated company. It was in the public eye. And, I'm proud of the fact that it didn't kind of turn into the Hunger Games, which it could have done. It didn't turn into the Hunger Games in the press. We kept the board together, kept the management team together. And in the end, despite what you might think about where the companies ended up, we did the right thing for shareholders, which was our job.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another moment of immense media attention.
Yeah.
Yes, you were used to that, right? Because you'd experienced it
I guess that
little bit before.
Didn't faze me so much. And I think the only thing that fazed me was, some of the Elon tactics that he uses through his lawyers are unpleasant, and that's not nice. But not personally, but the media stuff, I feel quite robust about that.
Yeah, it's good. It is really interesting. And like you say, it's definitely one of those moments that not everyone will experience.
No, it really won't. And I remember I've kept the FT, I think, because I have one of those kind of crazy 24-hour days. And then the next day on the front page of the FT was all this stuff about what we've been doing. I think this is so weird. It's like living in this parallel universe where there's all this noise about this deal, or at least there was noise around me. I don't mean me and the deal. I just mean where I was looking at my newspapers or the radio, and I'm in it. And it's just so strange. Sometimes you have this kind of weird discombobulation feeling. But yeah, it was certainly, I learned a lot, and I'm so lucky to have worked with some really spectacular people in the business. They really were amazing. But sometimes I forget that it was particularly intense because it came on the back of 2 things that I had to lead for the company. The first of which was managing Jack's transition out of the company and recruitment of the new CEO. So I led that process, and that was pretty high stakes and quite intense. and also had to move the activist investor Elliot off the board. And I remember I got a text message from the general counsel first week of January saying, well, nothing can possibly be as intense as 2021. Cut to then 2 months later, Elon wants to buy the company. I was like, oh my gosh.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely could be a career defining moment, but you've had many of those. Many of those.
Not sure.
So boards really do look at diversity and diversity of thought.
Yes.
And with that sort of thing, sometimes there can be friction, but sometimes that can be necessary as part of building a good team and building a challenging senior team, or even looking at the board itself.
Yeah.
What is one uncomfortable truth about how people can avoid the box tick and support that kind of constructive criticism without it getting too out of hand? I'm sure you've experienced a lot of egos in the various different boards that you've been on over the course of time or been part of. What do you think is a potential way through that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is read the room, right? Different CEOs or different executives react in different ways in different circumstances, of course, because we're all people and we all react in different ways at different times. So this kind of one way of being a critic or being a challenger might not always be effective. So read the room. And sometimes that will mean taking that discussion outside the boardroom, not because you're trying to have a sub-board meeting, but because it might be more appropriate just to say to the CEO, you know what, I didn't like it when you called out blah in the meeting. I could see they were uncomfortable. I just want to give you that feedback. I think it might be worth thinking about that moment. Or it might be that the right thing to do is to talk to a couple of other non-execs and say, look, do you think this is something we should be having a bit more of a discussion about, and then coming to the CEO like that? Or it might be absolutely that it's in the room. And very often that is the right way. And my own view is that you want to, partly this is a chair-based role, but it's also, you can add to this as a good non-exec. You want to build up trust by showing you understand the company, putting in the work, doing the time. You can't just walk into a boardroom and start criticizing everybody. That's obviously going to land deftly. But if people can see that you are trying to learn, you've been involved in the business, you've got to know some of the characters, you are doing the work, you've read the board papers. Again, I'm always shocked by how many people sometimes I feel like haven't read the board papers. Then I think that is your job. And it doesn't have to be that you're doing it in a way that sounds like you're being a complete arse. You can do it in a way that sounds like, I'm interested in this because when I was thinking about it, a different perspective came to me. How have you been thinking about that? If you want to kind of light touch, or you can say, look, just to give a perspective here, you told me 3 board meetings ago that by this board meeting, this was going to happen. Why in your opinion, has it not worked? Or something, there's always a way to challenge without making it sound like you're trying to be scoring points or be a bit of an arse. But I think the first thing is read the room, and it's not always that one mechanism that's going to be the most effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously on the flip side of having that constructive challenge is groupthink.
Yes.
How do you think that chairs and non-exec directors and the executives can help avoid that groupthink? Because that puts everybody at risk, personal reputations as well as potentially the organisation.
It's really hard. It's really hard. And I think it is good to have some grit in the oyster. I've been on boards where there's been really tricky people, and sometimes they've been tricky just being tricky and it hasn't helped, and then way of being tricky hasn't been good. But what they've been saying has often been right. I think, healthy boards, in my opinion, have a perspective, wide-ranging perspectives, and it is the chair's job to bring them out and not to be frightened sometimes, just to let those opinions sit there. You don't always have to react to everything. You can bring out people, who might say, Erika, what do you think? I'm sure you're going to have a different point of view, and you can sort of set it up, and then you can enable that person to speak. It's just basic common sense in many ways. But I do think letting everybody speak is a good way so that people find their voice. They feel like it's okay to talk. And you can definitely help as chair. And if you don't feel your chair is helping you, then talk to them and say, you might not be aware, but I don't feel I can speak this stuff. Can you help me express my opinion? Or what do you think? I think, building those outside relationships doesn't have to be in some kind of Lady Macbeth plot. It can just be being smart about building relationships, right? So that's what I enjoy doing on boards. I think helping them function better is really, really important. And just joined a board recently and just asked the CEO if I could have some time with them. And we had a really great couple of hours. Some of it was about the business. Some of it was nothing about the business. But I know that because of that, and he now trusts me a bit more, we know each other a bit better. I told him a couple of things I thought actually just about the format of the board meetings. And now I know that if I was going to challenge something a bit bigger and deeper, we've got that bank bit of trust. So, none of what I'm saying is anything other than common sense. But again, just a perspective from so many different boards is that I think often people don't think that it is important to put in the time on those relationships to build that trust as it is, in my opinion.
Yeah. And people are a human, right? So it's about having that humanity and bringing that to the leadership position, the same as you would do any other role.
But the other thing to remember is you are not an executive. You are non-executive, right? And so sometimes you will say things and you will be disagreed with and you will think they're wrong and you will probably be right. Sometimes you'll be wrong. Sometimes you might be right. That's it, right? You can only give your perspective. But I think accepting that you're not trying to drive always the outcome, that you're trying to kind of help in the process of the thinking. That's quite a good way of thinking about challenge as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And boards, when they have their conversations and debates, will talk about risk appetite.
Yes.
And I think fewer than I would hope really understand what that means.
Yep.
How do you think boards should approach risk? The world is fast changing, right? It's constantly evolving.
I think risk registers are one of the things that make me laugh the most. There's charts where you've got all these things plotted on a picture and you think, well, and I always say, what do you do with this? Where does this live in the business? And what has changed in the business because you've done this picture? And I think that's quite a good starting point. It's like, okay, how do you manage risk, and really understanding that as a board member so that you can get a sense of it. And obviously you have different levels of risk in different bits of a business and different life stages of a business, but just having a general discussion about, okay, what is our appetite for risk now? If you're just pre-IPO, probably quite low because you don't want to screw everything up and you want to make sure you're not going to do some crazy hire or some mad acquisition and things are going to go in the wrong direction. So I would say it does depend a bit on the time and place. And apart from that, I think you just got to keep it a live discussion, and it can't be, again, like when we started this conversation, risk, it's over there. Yeah. It's got to be something that you talk about as something that is living and breathing and that is a bit more intentional.
Yeah. And looking at risk, when things go wrong, that tends to lead to a crisis. And we've already mentioned a few of them, of those kind of intensive public scrutiny, or even IPO, which isn't necessarily a crisis, but it does create that tension. How did you stay calm?
I think I am just lucky. I am quite a calm person. I can get very excitable and I be completely ridiculous, but fundamentally I'm quite calm, and it's hard to analyze yourself, isn't it? But I don't mean to get the tiny violins out, but the accident I had was so completely life altering. I went from being an able-bodied person to a disabled person. And when that's your backdrop, you don't sweat the small stuff quite as much. You just don't, because I'm lucky to be able to walk. And so even when, Elon's swearing at you and you think you've got everything wrong and all that, it's like, just hold on. For me, just hold on to that, my central thing, which is I am alive and I am able to function. And so you just need to find a thing for you that's that thing. And I also, that's a bit personal perhaps, but perhaps more helpful. Don't have a catastrophic car accident. I'm not suggesting that. I just have a hinterland. I say this all the time. For me, again, it's reading, it's going to the theatre. Obviously, my family knows things, but it's incredibly important to me to have something else in my life. I'm not a kind of business maniac. I'm not an obsessive, just do work. That's my business work all the time. I would be terrible at that. I like writing. I love reading. I go to the theatre a lot. I enjoy a bunch of things. And if I have them in my life, I know I feel calmer and I can feel my head getting a bit like full up and hectic if I don't have that, what for me is a pressure valve and a release. So find your hinterland, whether that's exercise, being outside, reading a book, whatever it is, reading a poem.
Yeah. That's a really good piece of advice. It's probably a good piece of advice for anyone in any situation where it's stressful.
Yes, probably better than have a catastrophic car accident.
Yeah, but you talk about gratitude, and that's important. Yes. And it's gratitude for life and what you have. And I think that everybody can kind of take a piece of that and apply it.
Keeping perspective, I know some businesses are dealing with life and death. I get that. I've never really been involved in a business that's where people might actually die. I mean, now I'm on the board of British Airways. It's slightly different. I'm on the Safety and Security Committee for there, and Alison Britton, the brilliant other non-exec, she's always like, this is actually the only thing that I do where people might actually die. But generally, people aren't going to die. And so I think it's just worth, okay, so maybe our SaaS sales this year weren't that brilliant. I know it's something we have to work through, but just taking a breath and thinking about what it's like being a woman in Afghanistan, I also find that quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, talking about kind of hard decisions, what do you think is one of the hardest board decisions that you've been part of? And what did it teach you?
Definitely all the stuff around Elon was the hardest stuff I've had to deal with. Just the daily micro of the stuff he was throwing at us as a company, or he was throwing at the executive team, some of the decisions we had to make about comp or not for the team in the deal. Horrible, horrible decisions, and dealing with it was asymmetrical warfare because he was so out of control. Beyond that, I think in boards, the difficult decisions have normally been around CEOs and when to move one on and whether to hire a new one. I feel like I've been involved in far too many CEO transitions of big public companies, of smaller companies. It's never easy, especially if you have to move someone on when they weren't expecting it. So I think they're the two things.
Do you think that there's any way? I've also been in situations where I've seen CEOs being moved on and they were totally blindsided by the whole thing. I'm probably asking a question I don't even necessarily feel that even I could answer, but do you think that there is anything that boards should be doing, or maybe not, to tip off or advise that the CEO is potentially in that area? I know some of the situations...
Sorry to catch across. No, I think the board hasn't done its job if the CEO is blindsided.
Fair enough.
Because ideally you should have set up clear, measurable outcomes, metrics. You should be judging the person regularly, having regular feedback with them. And so it should never be a surprise. The board has not done its job well if it's a surprise. And from the other side as well, and if the CEO decides they want to leave, they should also have built some succession plans, had some open conversations. And that's all about creating a collaborative environment on the board. So it's not like them and us. The CEO feels they can talk to the chair. It doesn't have to be the whole board even, but that is the fundamental job of a board, is to make sure that companies run well. So I think that's a fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that myself with CEOs deciding to leave, and there is then just a gap because everyone thought that they were in it for the long term and they wanted to stick around and do whatever it might be. But there was just no way that was going to happen. And that was it. They were gone. Final question. If you were mentoring a new non-executive, so new to being a non-executive, that had just joined a board that you were on, what one piece of advice would you give them that you wouldn't find in a handbook?
I mean, I think a lot of things you probably would find in the handbook, but I'm not sure it's as easy to do them as you imagine. So I think the first thing is this combination of finding your voice quite quickly so that you establish yourself, but listening for a very long time. So that it can be a tricky combination, because when you first join a board, you think, I've got to speak, I must make myself heard. But a good chair will help you make yourself heard. But the main thing is just to keep listening and really, really, really try and learn the business. I think, as I said, I think the thing that lots of people don't do that's always valuable is just ask the other non-execs to spend half an hour with you, get their perspectives on things. They may look like they're a bit intimidating or they don't want to know, but that's not true. Everybody likes to be asked, but the worst they can do is say no. So I would always say, you probably would anyway spend time with the chair, but ask the other non-execs to spend half an hour with you and you'll learn a lot. And try and get that combination right of finding your voice, but also taking the time to really listen and learn from the business.
That's great. Thank you very much, Martha. It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. And if you're thinking about going on a board, do it, because it's an amazing extra piece of the puzzle in the career, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. There were a number of elements that stood out to me from the conversation I had today with Martha. One of them was around the learning curve that she experienced with lastminute.com. She was in her 20s and moving through that process, and also stepping towards the IPO process and what that meant for the organization and also for her personally was really interesting. I think the fact that she said that understanding funds and investors more would have helped her is hopefully incredibly helpful to organizations that are going down that IPO route, and allows them to think about some of these things maybe in a little bit more detail. She spoke about creating great teams, which is what she said was part, if not a very large part, of her success. And she said that building those teams was about having a strong sense of purpose, both personally, but also the team as well. I think that realistically, in today's modern world, modern boards, AI is going to be a topic that comes up regularly. And Martha spoke to us about that and said that it was really important to keep AI under consideration. She didn't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does, as she said. But that real life impact on people and humans is so important. Finally, I think the consequences of going public was something that really stood out to me. So she spoke about the consequences for her personally and the fact that she was pushed into the spotlight, even though she was a co-founder. She was personally the person that everybody wanted to talk to. And she also spoke about a lot of the negativity that came from that, and a lot of the criticism that came as a result. If you found this conversation valuable, please follow the show and share it with someone who leads through complexity. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay brave, and stay in the room.